So yes, this is CF API v2, a preemptive eulogy lightning talk. So we're going to go through this real fast. So briefly, we're going to give a quick overcap or review of what's going on with the v2 API. Then we're going to delve a little bit into the story of the v2 API, and then look back nostalgically on some of the great and maybe not so great features that the v2 API brought us. So a little bit about me. I go by Greg online. You may recognize my profile picture from GitHub or from the Cloud Foundry Slack. I'm currently a tech lead at VMware, and I'm also the tech lead for the application runtime interfaces working group. So before we start off, a couple disclaimers. First of all, this is a eulogy, not history. So this is just looking fondly back based on recollections and experiences, not deeply researched. So people have their own stories. I think it would be really interesting someday if someone wrote a detailed historical reference book for all of the things that happened on CAPI and Cloud Foundry in general, but this is not that. The other thing is, today I'm only going to be talking about CF deployment. So if you are consuming CF deployment directly, this will be relevant to you. If you're consuming a different release of Cloud Foundry from a different vendor, then this may not apply to you. So talk to whoever you're getting your CF from. All right, that's the end of the disclaimers. So for the CAPI v2 API end of life. So as my co-working group lead, Stefan, talked about at the Cloud Foundry Day Europe last year, and as other talks have referenced today, there was a RFC last year for finally bringing about the end of life of CAPI v2. Why are we ending CAPI v2? So again, as Stefan covered, maintaining the v2 API has been difficult over time, especially since a lot of the people who originally wrote it and worked on it are no longer working on Cloud Foundry. It has some performance issues, and even worse, because v2 and v3 share a lot of underlying infrastructure, a lot of those performance things ripple off and affect the v3 API. So it makes it harder to make improvements in that area. Also, the clients themselves that use the v2 API have similar problems. And as the cats have moved over to use the v3 API solely, we're missing a lot of regression coverage on v2, which makes changing it even more perilous. So a quick run through of the phases of the removal. So phase 1 was announcing the end of life of the API and making it so CF deployment is no longer built with the v2 API. Then there's a TOC checkpoint, followed by a phase 2 where the CFF maintained clients and third-party clients migrate off of the v2 API. Then there's another TOC checkpoint where they make sure that we're comfortable moving forward. And then finally in phase 3, it goes away. So this is where we are right now. So if you're working on a client that talks to the CF API, you should be working on moving towards v3. But keep the TOC up to date as to what you're working on and any blockers you have, because they're the ones who decide when we move forward to the next phase. So if you're actively working on it and you need more time, you should let the TOC know, and they can potentially help work around that. All right, now moving on to the eulogy. So here's my very, very brief story of the v2 API. So before the Cloud Controller next generation that we know, there was just the Cloud Controller. The Cloud Controller was a Ruby app, and it was pretty different than the Cloud Controller next generation that we know and love. Notably, apps belong directly to users. So if you were working on an app, it belonged to you. If other people on your team wanted to work on your app, they would need to get you to push it. It was a Ruby on Rails application, and there was a leading contributor to the original Cloud Controller who was in this room earlier. So they're still around. Then came along Cloud Controller Next Generation. This was a rewrite of Cloud Controller, and it introduced the v2 API. It had new exciting API features like being able to partially update resources instead of having to completely rewrite them. It also introduced pagination and filtering, And it also introduced organizations and spaces, so you could now collaborate on your app with your team using the new tenancy model. It also introduced billing, so you could charge for using Cloud Foundry and stuff like that. Instead of using Rails, it was built on Sinatra and SQL ORM, and then a custom framework built on top of that. And unlike the original Cloud Controller, it was test-driven, so it had a lot better test coverage. So this is what a controller class for the Cloud Controller Next Generation looked like at the beginning. As you can see, there's basically like no code in there. You just use some Ruby metaprogramming to define a bunch of properties, and then it auto-generates your API for you. And that's amazing because you don't have to write very much, but it also is scary because you don't know what it's doing. It's generating a whole bunch of stuff for you. So you may have just generated a bunch of endpoints that you didn't even know you wanted, or suddenly they appear. And then also, this is what it looked like in the initial commit, but this is what it looks like today. It's over 500 lines, and there's all sorts of special casing and potentially scary stuff in there. So definitely easy to maintain if you understand how it works, difficult to maintain if you don't understand how it works. And over time, less people understood how it worked. So some other V2 nostalgia. I talked to some people who had worked around V2 in the past, and here's some things that they remembered. So first of all is the docs. Just like the API, the docs were auto-generated, and they definitely looked like it. But they had a certain charm to them. Like here's the docs for retrieving a particular app. And you can see kind of what the results from the API look like. It's basically just a big blob of fields without any real organization around them. Probably the most infamous feature of the V2 API was inline relations depth. This is a query parameter you could pass to the API that would basically, you'd give it an integer and it would return all objects that were that level of association away from it. So by the time you start getting to inline relations depth 3, you're basically getting an entire schema dump of your database, and also you're probably crashing your database because of how expensive the query is. But it was very, very powerful and very easy to implement complex workflows around that. Another classic feature of the V2 API is P. Bozeman. He was the original person working on Cloud Controller NG, and if you go far enough back in Git history, it's always going to lead to P. Bozeman. So he's the bedrock. If you're opening a suitably old enough file, you're going to run into some commits by him. Another thing, looking at the resources with the most associated endpoints was definitely user roles. So they aren't all here, but just for managing user roles, there was over 70 different endpoints, and each of those endpoints had their own page in the API docs. So by weight, like a third of the API docs are just related to managing user roles. So one of the big changes on V3 was moving over to a much smaller set of endpoints for managing these user roles, which also led to some interesting technical problems internally. Another thing that I look back fondly on was grep comments. Again, because basically everything was metaprogrammed and generated for you. You would be tracing through something and see a method that was never defined anywhere. So people helpfully over time left messages for future generations to come and grep and find where that method was actually defined. So in the future, when people look for it, they can find where that method is. Also, the access classes. These were classes that, again, through the metaprogramming, defined what the permissions were for a given endpoint. And there was a point in time where every developer working on it eventually reached the access classes and realized, like, oh, this is how access is managed to all these different endpoints, because you're certainly not going to find anything in the controllers. All right. Then along came V3. So V3 was the API that we worked on to replace V2. It was a return to Rails, and one of the primary goals was making it easier for contributions from OSS and from other people who didn't know how the V2 API worked. And it focused a lot on having endpoints that were designed rather than generated, which was way more expensive and took a very long time to do. So looking to the future, is there going to be a V4 API? From where I'm standing right now, I'm going to say no. And if it does exist, it's going to be very similar to V3. So there's probably not going to be any more revolutionary rewrites of the API. But what there may be is some work in the CF manifest space. So there's recently accepted an RFC around a new version of the CF manifest. And this can be another way to rapidly affect configuration on applications running on Cloud Foundry. All right, so that's the end of my eulogy. If you want to reach me, come chat in our working group Slack or reach out to me directly. Thanks.